Chapter 7: Aquatic Ecology and Biodiversity in Aquatic Ecosystems. This chapter focuses on the ecosystems found in aquatic systems. In aquatic areas, we see small geographic locations in which we can see set abiotic factors which determine the biotic factors that live there. In terrestrial systems, these are called biomes. In aquatic systems, they are called aquatic life zones. The two major types of aquatic life zones are marine and freshwater. Marine life zones include coral reefs, coastal marshes, swamps, oceans, and mangroves. Freshwater life zones include lakes, ponds, and streams. Some life zones, such as estuaries, act as ecotones between marine and freshwater life zones. These areas generally have water that is neither salty nor freshwater, but in between. This water is called brackish water. These areas generally serve as nurseries for immature organisms normally found in marine life zones because there is a low threat from predators. Aquatic life zone food webs have the same structure as terrestrial food webs, but are comprised of different organisms. The producers that make up the lowest trophic level are comprised of microscopic phytoplankton near the surface, as well as chemosynthesizers on the deep ocean floors. Next, we have zooplankton. These are still microscopic but cannot generate their own energy and must obtain it from other organisms. If they eat phytoplankton, then they are primary consumers. If they eat each other, then they are secondary consumers. The remaining consumers are based off of their motility, or the ability to move. Nekton are free-swimming organisms that are consumers, like sea turtles, and benthos are bottom-dwelling consumers that cannot freely swim to obtain their food source. Last, we have decomposers. These, again, are the nutrient cyclers, and are generally found in the lower levels of the aquatic life zones. Aquatic ecosystems are said to be less fixed by space boundaries than terrestrial biomes. Organisms are free to swim between layers. They typically have more complex food webs as a result. Because of water's high specific heat, these ecosystems do not typically see drastic changes in water temperatures. Water is not considered to be the major limiting factor for plant life because the organisms are immersed in it. The major limiting factor for aquatic life zones is salinity. Major concerns for these life zones are mainly pollution-based. Any pollution that is in the water directly affects the organisms that live in it because they are surrounded by it. Aquatic life zones are broken up based off of depth. There is the surface layer, the bottom layer, and the layer in between. The depth of an aquatic zone determines the temperature, sunlight concentration, dissolved oxygen content, and nutrient levels. These varying factors in turn determine the organisms that live in each of these zones. We'll start with marine systems. The surface layer is most commonly known as the euphotic zone because this is the layer that receives the highest level of sunlight penetration. As expected, the deeper you travel into water, the harder it is for sunlight to penetrate. In this area, we expect to see the highest level of dissolved oxygen because this is the place in which the water is directly interacting with the atmosphere, where oxygen is diffusing into and out of the water. The further down you travel, the lower the level of dissolved oxygen we would expect to see. Most of the nutrients found in aquatic systems are in the deepest levels because this is where most of the decomposition and recycling of nutrients occurs. As a result, we expect to see low levels of nutrients in the euphotic zone. It is also warmer here because of the sunlight penetration. The bathyal zone, or the middle zone, will have rates of everything mentioned before in between the euphotic zone and the abyssal zone, the lowest zone. In the abyssal zone, we would expect low temperatures due to no sunlight penetration, low dissolved oxygen levels due to it being far from the surface, high nutrient levels because of high rates of decomposition, and no photosynthesis due to no sunlight penetration. Ecological services of marine systems include climate moderation due to water's high specific heat, carbon dioxide absorption, as we discussed in the carbon cycle. Remember, the ocean is the biggest carbon sink we have. Nutrient cycling, waste treatment and dilution, reduced storm impact to coastal areas, habitats and nursery areas for marine and terrestrial species, as well as genetic resources and biodiversity. Economical services of marine systems include food, animal and pet feed, pharmaceuticals, harbors and transportation routes between the continents, coastal habitats for humans, recreation, employment, offshore oil and natural gas, minerals, and building materials. We expect to see the highest level of primary productivity, or plant-based energy production, in the coastal areas off of the continents. This is because these areas combine the best of the euphotic and abyssal zones. The shallow waters allow for sunlight to penetrate for photosynthesis, high levels of dissolved oxygen, warmer temperatures, and the high nutrient levels we expect to see in the abyssal zone of the open ocean. There are many marine life zones including barrier islands, rocky sandy shores, and coastal wetlands, but the life zone most impacted by humans happens to be the area with highest biodiversity, coral reefs. These life zones are incredibly sensitive to changes in temperature, salinity, and pH. High levels of pollution from coastal development, as well as increased ocean temperatures and lower pH levels due to global warming, result in increased levels of carbon dioxide in the water. Freshwater systems have some of the same patterns as marine systems, but there are few changes mainly based on depth as well as the potential to be affected by seasons. Freshwater systems still see warmer temperatures at the surface, higher levels of dissolved oxygen at the surface, higher levels of nutrients at the base, and higher levels of sunlight penetration near the surface. The littoral zone is a zone near the shore in which sunlight completely penetrates through. These are the areas in which we expect to see the highest levels of biodiversity. The limnetic zone is the zone in which light penetrates in the open lake. Both the littoral and limnetic zones see the same effects we saw in the euphotic zone of the ocean. Next, we have the profundal zone. This is the area in which we see the same characteristics of the bathyal zone of the ocean. Fish generally spend most of their time in this zone to avoid the heat near the surface. The final zone is the benthic zone. This zone has the same characteristics of the abyssal zone of the ocean, but there are no hydrothermal vents to allow for chemosynthesis in lakes and ponds. Ecological services for freshwater systems include climate moderation, nutrient cycling, waste treatment and dilution, flood control, groundwater recharge, habitats for aquatic and terrestrial organisms, genetic resources, and biodiversity. Economical services include food sources, drinking water, irrigation water, hydroelectricity, transportation corridors, recreation, and employment. The age of a lake can be partially determined by the level of plant nutrients found in it. Eutrophication is the natural aging of a lake. An oligotrophic lake is a newly formed lake. It is geographically new, is fairly deep, and appears a bright blue color because of the lack of photosynthetic life. Over time, runoff occurs and brings plant nutrients from the soils that surround the lake. These nutrients build up and allow for higher levels of photosynthetic life. Older lakes that have undergone this process are known as eutrophic lakes. They are generally much shallower due to high levels of sediment buildup and appear a green or brown color due to plant growth and turbidity, or sediment pickup. If a lake falls between these two extremes, then it is considered a mesotrophic lake. Humans can speed up this process by introducing plant nutrients to a lake in the form of runoff from industrial, agricultural, and municipal areas. Lakes are small enough bodies of water to be affected by seasons in temperate areas that actually experience true seasons based on temperature. Here, we separate lakes into different levels. The epilimnion is the area closest to the surface. The hypolimnion is at the base, and occasionally we see a thermocline that melds the first into the second. In the summer, the epilimnion is rich in dissolved oxygen, has a higher temperature, and is low in nutrients. The hypolimnion is low in dissolved oxygen, has a lower temperature, and is high in nutrients. There's a thermocline in which the water gets warmer as you go deeper. During the fall, the surface of the water cools quickly and starts to sink. This creates the autumnal overturn in which we do not see any true layers. The temperature, nutrient levels, and oxygen levels are consistent throughout the entire body of water. In the winter, the surface of the water freezes and floats because solid water is less dense than liquid water. This creates an inverted thermocline. The epilimnion still sees higher levels of oxygen and low levels of nutrients, and the hypolimnion sees the opposite. There is still a thermocline, but it is the opposite of what is expected in the summer because the epilimnion is the coldest and the hypolimnion is the warmest. This creates a scenario in which the water gets warmer as you go deeper. During the spring, the winds pick up due to differences in temperature in the atmosphere, and we see another overturn known as the spring overturn. This again creates a lake with only one true layer with consistent oxygen, nutrient, and temperature levels throughout.